In this video here, I'm going to talk about fonts and using them for prepress and using them in your designs. So fonts is a huge topic and there's millions of fonts out there. And they've had a long and varied history of being used in computers. So many years ago, fonts were not compatible between Windows and Apple computers. So you had to get fonts for each computer system, and it was a mess just trying to get share files and to get them to printers and so on. So some of those fonts were broken into two types, and you can see them here that the first type I'm going to talk about is PostScript, commonly known as Type 1 font. And these were usually for Mac computers, Apple computers, a long time ago. So a PostScript font has two parts to it, a screen font and a printer font. And what that means is that that a font, you would have two separate font files where you'd have two separate font files that one was a screen font that was pixelated. Think of it as a raster image, a bitmap image of the font. And the other one was a vector version of it, which was called the printer font. And the screen font was used when it was on your screen so that you could have it, look at it on your computer screen. But then when you went to send it to the printer would access the outlined font, the vector font, to use it to create the font shapes for the printing presses. So traditionally, there were two font files for each font that you wanted to use, and that was hard to keep track of. And they were also limited in characters, and so you only had a certain number, like 250 or 6 or 300 or 500 characters. And you had to have a separate version for Apple and a separate version for Windows. And if they switched, they wouldn't always match up and cause problems. But PostScript fonts are still used, and they're okay. It's fine to use them. The other type is TrueType fonts, and that was commonly known for Windows computers back at that time. And this was where the two font, the screen and the printer font, were combined into the same single file, which was a better way to manage. But it had the same issues with limited characters, and TrueType fonts were actually problematic for press shops way back in the 80s and 90s. And so they developed another type of font called the OpenType font down here. You got your OpenType fonts. And those are cross-platform, so the same font file could work on a Windows computer as it does onto a Mac. And these are what we mostly have now currently, that the same font file is cross-platform. It's a single file that will have both the screen font and the printer font in it. Plus, it has tens of thousands of characters, or they can. Depends on what font you're using, but it'll have all the characters, it'll have all the glyphs, it'll have symbols and special characters and the multilingual usage. So you get Arabic characters and characters from other languages in there. So OpenType fonts are really versatile, and they work great, and that's mostly what we use nowadays. So it's important to make sure that your fonts are good. And what I mean by that is that there's fonts developed professionally, and there's fonts that can be developed by amateurs. And there's a lot of free fonts out there, and you can get a free font and it will not work for commercial printing. So what I mean by that is that it won't embed into a PDF, or if you send the font file to the commercial printer, they won't be able to run it through the processing to make the plates. So if fonts don't embed in a PDF, or you can't create an outline with them, then they're bad fonts and you should not use them. I'll show you how to test them here in a minute. So fonts do create a lot of problems, so choose them wisely. To test your font, what you want to do is just open up a new InDesign file. Make sure the font's loaded in your computer. Just add some text to your document using that font, and then export it to a PDF as if you're going to send what to the print shop. So you would use the PDF preset X1A. There's a separate video on that in this module, or maybe not in this module. If this is a different year, then anyways, I got a separate video for that. But if you export it with PDF X1A, that's the commercial quality PDF preset, an error will display if the font does not embed, and you should know to not use it. Even if it does produce the PDF, you should open it up and check anyways to see that the font displays correctly. If it does, then it should work, should be okay. Just some other tips here on fonts. Never rename them. Don't change the file names of them. And to make sure you always include them with your layout. So you either package them in InDesign, or you make sure that you copy them and they go with your graphics files to the printer. When you're using fonts, don't use stylized typefaces. And what a stylized typeface is when you have this here and I highlight this text and I say use bold. That's stylized typefacing, stylized type. Microsoft Word is just making that bold instead of going in and selecting the font. And that's why you notice in InDesign that the fonts will have a bold version like this. So you'd want to use the bold version of that. So make sure that you don't use that. And InDesign and Illustrator, it doesn't really give you that option very much. But always check your TrueType and your Type 1 fonts if you're using them. And that if you replace them, that they're not going to be exactly the same. There might be character spacing issues and things like that, which could affect the flow of the type. And make sure that you're licensed to use it, so don't steal fonts. Just a brief review about registration. It's okay to use colored fonts, but just be careful about putting thin white text on a colored background. When it comes to printing, that thin white text can get filled in quite easily. And just for readability and legibility there. And there's also just a few other things on to be aware of, like ligatures here. Sorry. That if you're using ligatures, those can disappear and reappear if you're using different font files loaded from different computers. So brush up on your typography, be aware of what you're using your fonts for, and you should be okay. The last bit is using fonts in InDesign. So there's a separate video for this, how to replace the fonts. But if you go to the Type menu and find font, then you can see what fonts are in your document. It'll give you warning signs in this area right here if there is an error, and then you can replace them. And that other video shows you how to do that.